Looks like Modern's back on the menu with a plethora of different decks and tons of different cards. Is Modern in the best state it's ever been? Find out right now.
Pro Tour Edge of Eternities featuring Spider-Man, but definitely not Pro Tour Spider-Man, has just concluded with EOE Draft in addition to rounds of Modern Constructed, including the top 8. Now, the event featured a large variety of decks like Graveyard Combo, to Creature Combo, to Lands Combo, to Toolbox Combo, skipping up the moniker for big threats that don't end the game immediately combo, and Energy. Now, but all jokes aside, despite only being a 299-person Pro Tour event, there were a large variety of decks in Atlanta that do highlight the diversity and just balance overall of the Modern format, while at the same time displaying exceptionally peak gameplay at the pro level for a fan-loved format, especially in the top 8. If you haven't seen it, go back and rewatch it. A lot of really technical play. Now, as always with these recaps, we'll be looking at how the Pro Tour metagame shaped up as a whole before jumping into the most popular decks and focusing on the other archetypes surrounding them based on popularity tier. Now, from there, we'll highlight the most winning decks in the room, even if they only had a handful of copies being played, before we go back to the most played decks in the room and see how they matched up in head-to-head matchup matrix so that you can use that information for your own local or online events being played in the near future. And as always, I just want to note where the data is coming from. We will be using the Melee platform's results for the Pro Tour with 299 registered players and deck lists provided. Now, we will only be accounting for the Modern portion of the event, while all deck archetypes are presumed to be checked and accurate since this is a very high-profile Wizards of the Coast event. Now, we'll be including all rounds of play, even the top 8 portion of this event, while buys will not count towards wins for players or the deck archetype as a whole. However, ties are still accounted for unless noted in a non-tie statistic such as win rate minus ties or win percent minus T. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get started on the breakdown. Of the 299 decks registered, there were a total of 32 different archetypes that got played at the Pro Tour. Now, 11 of these archetypes had just one copy in the room, making up 34.4% of the different archetypes played, while 4 decks had 2 copies in the room, which made up another 12.5% of the decks played. Now, likewise, there were 4 decks also that had 3 copies in the room, so that was the same 12.5% here. But then we skip up the curve a little bit and find 1 deck with 6 different copies in the room, resulting in a 3.1% share of the archetypes played. There were 2 decks with 8 copies in the room, making up another 6.3% of the different archetypes that were played, and the top 10 presence decks all had at least 12 or more copies being played, resulting in the remaining 31.3% of the deck archetypes represented at the Pro Tour. Now, of those 32 different archetypes, Esper Goryo's was the most played one at the Pro Tour, with 50 decks representing 16.7% of the field, which is kind of on par, if not slightly above what we were kind of expecting from just a Modern metagame looking at how decks have performed recently standpoint. Now, Tameshi Belcher, which is definitely a little more popular in paper than it is online, represented the second most played deck with 45 copies at 15.1% of the metagame share. Meanwhile, the old top of the Modern metagame staple Boros Energy was now the third most played deck here. 41 pilots sleeved up their Energy decks with 13.7% of the metagame share. Now, Eldrazi Tron was the more popular of the 2 different flavors of Eldrazi, as this one using the Urza lands had 22 different pilots, making up 7.4% of the decks in the room, whereas the ramp version using Utopia Sprawl and Mycosynth and everything along those lines was a little more green, had 12 pilots at 4% of the Modern metagame. Izzet Affinity was making tons of robots and doing it pretty darn quick, including suiting up some Kappa Cannoneers ahead of schedule. 20 pilots made up 6.7% of the metagame with this deck, while Felia and all of their blink targets was not as popular as we thought it was going to be. Only 17 pilots brought that deck to the metagame here for 5.7% share. The quintessential modern combo deck that seems to always keep on kicking, Amulet Titan, had 14 pilots. That's 4.7% of the modern metagame at the Pro Tour, where a different type of combo deck was turning elf riding dinosaurs, or dinosaur riding elves, technically, the other one would be a little more hilarious, into giant demons and Phyrexian angels. Simic Neoform had 13 different decks for 4.3% of the metagame share, and then rounding out the top 10 most popular decks is Domain Zoo, another 12 copies of that deck for 4% of the overall metagame share, representing a tiny bit lower percentage than I was assuming we would see from there. There are a couple of other standout archetypes, such as the top 8 archetypes in Azorius Control and Izzet Prowess. Both of these had 8 total pilots for 2.7% share of the overall modern Pro Tour metagame. And then there were 3 different flavors of Broodscale combo, Mono Green, Golgari, and Gruul. The Golgari and Mono Green split the difference at 2 decks apiece for 0.7% of the modern metagame share, while a singleton Gruul Broodscale pilot was 0.3% of the metagame. Now we're going to hone in on that metagame breakdown and take a look at what some of the most popular decks in the room were, which is basically a way to group together different deck archetypes based on how many copies were being played in the room. We get this by assigning all the different amounts of deck archetypes and then laying them out across a normal distribution, so we are using standard deviations back from your high school math days to determine what tier these decks are, and then rating them from D all the way up to S to see how they compete within their tiers, and then see what you might see at your local or online metagame based on these letter grades. With a smaller event like this Pro Tour, decks like Esper Goryos with 50 decks in the room get to sit in a tier of their own at S tier, despite other decks having only a few less copies overall. Now, regardless of this, the deck proved to be just about as powerful as it was popular, with an average win rate of 50.1% to match the number of decks in the room. That's pretty impressive, as the combo plan A is susceptible to graveyard hate, many of which are main deck in this specific list, as well as others, which goes to show how strong the backup Psychic Frog plan can be. Now, with this so close to dead even, it does go to show that even though the deck was one of the most played in the room, it still had the tools to deal with the overall metagame at the PT. For players that may not be as invested in Modern before watching this event, a deck with a 50-50 record like this would be an appealing option to look at if you want to get in the format. Although later on in the video, we'll break down specific matchups where the deck may be stronger or weaker to give you a better picture of how it operates and how it might match up against your local metagame before you press that checkout button. I see you with the cards in your cart already. Just underneath Goryos and decks played are the 2 now A-tier deck lists at the event, Tameshi Belcher combo and Boros Energy. One of these decks is the quote-unquote new Jund of the format, while the other one ended up taking down the entire event. But if you look at the overall win rate of both of these decks, only one of those might make sense. Sorry, Jund gamers, I'm self-deprecating here a little bit too. I'm on your side here. Boros was at the top of the modern metagame for such a long time, as plans of going wide with tokens, going tall with Guided Souls, or going fast with Flage plus Arena of Glory provide tons of different angles of attack that can either synergize well with one another, or tax all the answers that your opposing decks have against you. Yet despite all of this, the deck does play more on the fair access of Magic gameplay, meaning that the decks that can go larger, like Tron, or more combo-based decks, like Belcher here, can end up hitting them in a sore spot if they do not have the tools in hand at the right time to deal with them. Now, speaking of that Belcher deck, the deck may have won the event, but it ended up with just a 47% win rate, coming in by 3 percentage points under 50% win rate even. Now, with 0 actual lands and plenty of blue cards to work as fodder for Force of Negation, Disrupting Shoal, these free interaction spells, the deck powered out Goblin Charbelcher by setting up turns with tons of mana, thanks to Lotus Bloom and Tameshi Reality Architect, as the name suggests, to shoot opponents for lethal damage. Now, more interaction in the list, like Into the Flood Maw, as well as tutoring tools like Word of Invention, made this majority plan A deck protected and redundant enough for most matchups, but not impervious to the ebb and flow of the modern metagame, which we'll take a look at later on in the head-to-head matchup matrix. Now, when we look at the number of decks played, we're jumping down to almost half the amount from the A tier, which means we're skipping clear over B tier and going all the way down to C tier, where we do find some fan favorite decks such as multiple flavors of Eldrazi, Blink, Amulet Titan, and Zoo. But there are also 2 other archetypes mixed into the fray of C-tier decks, such as Simic Neoform, turning elves riding dinosaurs into giant flying demons, got it right this time, or Izzet Affinity throwing out robots, artifacts, and giant Blastoise wannabes way ahead of the turn schedule. Now, of all these different lists, the timeless combo classic Amulet Titan dominated the C-tier and the tournament with a 57% win rate overall. Now, Titan had the highest win rate of the decks in these tier, as well as the decks with 3 or more copies being played, period, showcasing that the deck evolves beyond just playing Primeval Titan Kill and has gained the resiliency to combat the other decks in the format. Just don't ever give me the deck to play unless you really want to laugh out loud at how bad someone could pilot the list. Eldrazi Tron was slightly better win rate of the 2 Eldrazi variants, using the classic Tron lands in addition to some of the larger Tron payoffs amongst its suite of Eldrazi cards like Devourer of Destinies, while the Utopia Sprawl sowing Micah Spawn version without the Urza lands saw less winning alongside a little less play overall. The Izzet Affinity list just missed out on top 8 in the hands of both Alex Fredrickson and fan favorite Shuhei Nakamura, but stood on a slightly above average 50.6% win rate overall, with or without weapons manufacturing in the list. Now, the rest of the decks here underperformed for one reason or another, and I underpronounce that word, which we'll be able to dive into a little bit more later on when we look at the top presence head-to-head matchup matrix, which for Blink and Zoo pilots will be something to see if there's any sort of tweaks we can make in our list to maybe raise that win rate a little bit, while some of the pilots like the Neoform pilots know that some percentage of their matches are going to be a little coin flippy anyway. Going from what was popular to what performed well, this next section is going to take a look at the overall highest win rate decks, regardless of the number of decks that were actually played. Now, sample size does matter. So this is not to say that these decks we're going to talk about are the best in the metagame. No, instead, this looks to give brewers and deck artisans alike some ideas, as this snapshot here gives a peek into what was out there and performing at this specific event. So you can take some ideas, see some cards you may have missed, and then try to plug and play them in your own lists, or take one of these lists to your local event to see if you can really go the distance. Matt Costa sat in the top 20 overall, in addition to playing the highest win rate modern deck in the room with Jeskai Blink, a departure from the Orzhov and Esper versions we're used to seeing, subbing in red for cards like Ragavan, Lightning Bolt, and of course, Flage to play an angle some Boros pilots tried out in different iterations during the modern metagame. Felia Exuberant Shepherd was still one of the main attractions to the archetype alongside Ephemerate to really take advantage of these ETB triggers on cards like Solitude, while Quantum Riddler's warp cost could be bypassed by the blink effects to not only draw a ton of cards, but keep the big flyer around ahead of schedule like it was an incarnation itself. Now, Consigned to Memory works overtime as a main deck quote-unquote sideboard card, as its worst case scenario is countering our own Evoke or Warp triggers to keep things on the battlefield, while at its best, it's able to punish opposing triggers and some of the lists like the Eldrazi or Affinity decks specifically. Now, while the red doesn't give much in sideboard tech, 4 copies of White Orchid Phantom and Lavinia Azorius Renegade help to punish those Tron-y, Titan-y, and Ramp decks, while 3 Wrath of the Skies can punish anything that plays to the board despite not having a dedicated energy package to pour into it. 2 different pilots took the mono-green Broodscale list for a spin at the PT and ended up with the second highest win rate between the 2 of them. Now, the Eldrazi Pact Creature combo deck had its normal pieces with Basking Broodscale, Blade of the Blood Chief, and Glaring Fleshraker in 4 of Order, as you can see on the screen here, with multiple copies of Walking Ballista or Emrakul the Promised End as additional ways to end the game. Now, going mono-green meant less potential sideboard cards, at least in multicolor format, but main deck sowing Micah Spawn for Disruption Angle alongside, most specifically, Ancient Stirrings in addition to Malevolent Rumble to find its pieces. Now, the deck has been putting up performances since the last larger Modern event, although the numbers overall have dwindled as pilots look to splash additional colors, branching into Gruul or Golgari alongside the strictly green version at this event. Another creature-based combo deck had 2 pilots at the PT, although Paul Sau did the heavy lifting going 7-3 with the Samwise Gamgee combo deck. 30 creatures with a plethora of 1 and 2 elves in the list. The Samwise Cauldron Familiar Sack Outlet combo that you see on your screen was buffed up by a couple of Spider-Man cards, including Arachne, Psionic Weaver, and Silk Web Weaver, to give the deck disruption or a small overrun type effect thanks to web slinging. Now, Birthing Ritual remains an all-star piece of this list, as its ability to find pieces before choosing what to sacrifice makes the deck able to kill on its own end step. Or you can do it on its opponent's turn thanks to tools like Chord of Calling being able to do it at instant speed. Now, having a singleton Yawgmoth has seemed to be the way to build the lists, although the combo with Young Wolf is entirely absent from Paul's list here. However, a list the Young Wolves weren't missing from was Benton Madison's Golgari version of the Broodscale combo, packing 2 combos potentially in one deck list. Now, Benton wasn't the only pilot on the Golgari version of the deck. Pilot Elengo had a different version without Yawgmoth that did some things differently, like getting a pseudo Skull Clamp replacement, but Benton was the higher placing of the 2 overall, going 7-2-1 with the deck during the Modern portion. Doing everything the previous Broodscale list did, save for exchanging Ancient Stirrings for Dredger's Insight, the Black Splash allowed for the classic combo of Fatal Push and Thoughtseize to be utilized in the sideboard, but also offered up Fulminator Mage, which went alongside a full 4 of Agatha's Soul Cauldron in the main deck, to really cause chaos and headaches against those lands matter decks like Titan and Tron. Carlos Sousa took Izzet Wizzies with a splash of 2 Murktide Regents to a 60% overall win rate at the PT, as Flame of Anor, Tamiyo, and plenty of interactive spells put the pressure on opponents from the get-go. Now, not going as far as some of the other Tamiyo lists that we've seen in the quote-unquote unfair direction, this list is what Modern players have long looked at as a fair Izzet deck, even going as far as to cap out what said Murktides to really hammer the point home. So this is kind of like where Murktide pilots have moved to at this point. Now, sideboard, the deck could get even more Murktide-like with 3 Ragavan flanked by 4 Consigned to Memory for all the different decks that card can shut down, while 3 Obsidian Charmaw look to punish decks playing Urza or Eldrazi lands specifically. Speaking of some traditional Modern deck archetypes, Eli Kassis and Raja Solomon both registered Jeskai Control as an archetype that may bring back fond Snapcaster Mage memories to Modern players. However, Raja was the only player with Snapcaster Mages, as Eli, who did have a better record overall in the event, leaned into the Blink side of things, playing 4 Consigned to Memory, 2 Ephemerate, and 4 copies of Quantum Riddler, Flage, and Solitude in the main deck. So while the control, air quotes, fits the package of counter magic, board wipes, and removal that Eli was packing in the list, this deck was going to turn a corner on a dime when it took the lead. Now, Eli did pack a singleton Jace the Mind Sculptor in the main deck, showing that JTMS can still rock into a 2025 Modern event. But the sideboard Felia and Charmaz show that Eli wasn't too far off trying what Matt Costa did, and Matt Costa did have the most winning deck at the event. Now, as I mentioned before, Amulet Titan was the most winning deck archetype with more than 3 copies in the room in Atlanta, which was good enough to also make it the 7th most winning archetype overall. Now, the only archetype on this list so far to crack into the top 8, Mason Buadana, I'm sorry if I butchered that last name, but their list had all the recent tech added to the deck, from Ice Till Explorer to Urza's Cave, to make sure that this combo could kill someone no matter which line of that 50-page guide it was reading and playing towards. 3 copies of Green Sun Zenith, 2 copies of Summoner's Pact, 2 copies of Scapeshift, and 0 copies of Cultivator Colossus may be the only real talking points of difference between this list and some others at the event or just in general, while a sideboard Gadok Teague was a cheeky piece of hate tech that other lists didn't run. You could, in theory, green Sun Zenith for your own Teague, and then shut off your opponent's GZZs altogether. Try saying that 5 times fast. GZZ. I can't even do it. Just like I can't play Titan. Not quite sold on the red splash that Costa had. 6 different pilots took Azorius Blink to the 8th most winning deck at the event, mashing together the best parts of Energy and the best parts of the Felia package while honing in on the blue as that secondary color that they really wanted. Now, Guided Souls, Ocelot Pride, and Felia are no strangers to playing together in some older Boros lists, but the addition of White Orchid Phantom, Solitude, and Quantum Riddler, all as amazing blink targets, gave the deck a more unfair angle at attack than the old Hasty Flage normally provides, if you can call Flage fair with Arena of Glory. Starfield Shepherd was a 3-up in Gabriel Nassif's list, as the Hall of Famer took 12th overall at this Pro Tour event, providing a way to find your energy-based 1-drops as well as Mockingbird to potentially become an extra one of pretty much anything you needed, even on your opponent's side of the board. Now, a singleton copy of Spider Sense in the sideboard is the only new set card that Gabe played in the list, allowing for a 1-mana counterspell that would allow for Felia or another ETB trigger creature to be redeployed later on, thanks to bouncing it back to your hand with Web Slinging. Francisco Sanchez almost won it all with Azorius Control, but he, as well as 7 additional pilots, put up major results across the board with the classic color control archetype. Now, Francisco specifically went back to a different pairing of cards, eschewing the blink packages that other decks were boarding in, and instead opting for the Orum's Chant Isochron Scepter combo, as well as packing the Narset Parter of Veils Days Undoing to really lock opponents out of the game. Now, a singleton copy of Gyro Reach Sanitarium even made the deck truly lock opponents out of anything that wasn't instant speed under a Narset wall, while Counterspell, Force of Negation, and Teferi Time Raveler prevented them from interacting with the complete control state that they could lock down on the board. Kahira as a companion buffed up Solitude and Subtlety enough to present a decent clock, closing out games behind its powerful Planeswalker or Artifact shield. Now, last but certainly not least was yet another top 8 archetype, as Justin Chabelle took Izzet Prowess to the top of Atlanta's standings, but fell in the quarterfinals of the Pro Tour. Now, leaning in on the Prowess plus Core Steel Cutter power, which this is the first deck we've seen Core Steel Cutter in, the deck really turned the pressure on with a full playset of Mutagenic Growth, as well as the 1-mana potential double strike buff that 2 copies of Violent Urge gave to threats like Slick Shot Show Off, which potentially ends a game in one massive swing on the spot. Now, with Preordain and Expressive Iteration as card velocity engines, the deck could quickly pump out a round of 3 or more spells in a turn, resulting in almost 20 damage from a singleton creature alone. Post-board, Justin specifically had some heavier hitters with 2 copies of Murktide Regent. Since the deck was fueling its graveyard like crazy anyway, you can just delve those away really fast, while the rest of the board was all sorts of interaction, including full playsets of both Consigned to Memory and Unholy Heat. So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head-to-head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others. Esper Goryos is one of the most played decks at the Pro Tour, which means that we have the largest sample size for that deck, and we're going to get the best picture compared to all the other decks that we see in this head-to-head matchup matrix. Now, if you remember back from that popularity tier being the 1S tier deck, Esper Goryos had a 50% win rate against the entire Pro Tour metagame, which, as you can see here from its head-to-head matchup matrix, doesn't mean that it was 50-50 against every single deck. It clearly had some matches where it was better and some matches where it was not as good. Pointedly out here, you can see that the Boros Energy matchup, the Esper Blink matchup, the Amulet Titan matchup, and the Simic Neoform matchup specifically were more in favor of the Esper Goryo's list, while the Tameshi Belcher combo, Eldrazi Tron, Izzet Affinity, Domain Zoo, and Eldrazi Ramp lists were slightly in favor of the opposing decks rather than the Esper Goryo's deck. When you take a look at all of this, you can see how it can kind of even out to more of a 50% win rate, although the higher win rate against the Simic Neoform deck is probably just because the Neoform deck is a little more all in on its combo and not so much against its interaction package, letting Goryo just kind of do the Goryo's thing as quickly as possible, which is probably a little faster than Neoform can even get itself started up. So down the line against the rest of the field, you know that there's going to be a little bit more of a mix-up here, considering the Goryo's deck is 50-50, and out of the top 10 presence decks, it's still ever so slightly favored. You can see that the non-mirror win rate matchup here at the bottom, the NM win rate on their screen, is basically going to be 50.7%, so it's not too much higher than the 50-50 it had against the field. So if you're in a local metagame and you are not playing against any of the decks with a higher win rate against the deck here, Esper Goryo's is going to look like a pretty safe pick. However, if you're thinking that there are a bunch of Eldrazi decks running around in your metagame, or maybe that Izzet Affinity deck is going to pick up steam, you may want to think about potentially switching out some of your sideboard cards or doing something different than what Esper Goryo's has to offer. Tameshi Belcher as a combo deck is naturally going to have some decks where it can just kind of goldfish its own game plan against, and then other ones that are specifically going to interact with it in ways that it has difficulty dealing with. The Esper Blink deck specifically seems to be the one that Tameshi Belcher had the most issues with here at the Pro Tour, even though it's only a 14 match sample size. So do with that information as you will if you're expecting to see an uptick in Felias and such at your local meta. However, Tameshi Belcher did do pretty decently against the other top combo deck in the room, Esper Goryo's, with an over 50% win rate in that head-to-head matchup, and in some of the other combo matchups, like against the Simic Neoform deck, Belcher was the better of the combo deck. However, against more of the fair decks, just like this Boros Energy list with a 64.4% win rate, the Tameshi Belcher deck could just kind of run them over. Now, there were some decks that were either bigger, faster, or stronger than the Belcher combo. The Eldrazi Tron deck specifically was better than the Eldrazi Ramp deck, as putting something big on the battlefield to try to kill Tameshi Belcher before it comboed off is better than trying to slow it down and only taking 3 damage pot shots at them as they go. So the Tameshi Belcher deck, again, in a field with more fair decks, is probably going to be something you may want to take to your LGS, or in a combo metagame, Tameshi Belcher may just be the better combo deck due to all of the mono blue interaction that it is packing to protect itself, deal with your opponent's combo, and still have the means with which to Tameshi Charbelcher somebody. This one may hurt a little bit. Here we go to the Jund of the format here. Boros Energy against the top 10 decks did not do very well into the top end of that. 44.2% win rate against Esper Goryo's, 35.6% against Tameshi Belcher, and 38.9% against Eldrazi Tron is nothing to shake a stick at. However, the more bottom half of this metagame picture does look a little bit better for the Boros Energy deck, as Esper Blink and Izzet Affinity, which have more fair game plans, if you can call the Izzet Affinity deck fair, they do play to the board more than those other decks. They're winning matchups here with even a 57.1% win rate in the Esper Blink head-to-head. Some of the other matches down towards the bottom are just kind of 50-50 toss-ups, which is pretty much where Jund wants to be, while Amulet Titan is a 45% win rate, which means it's Jund favored, right? That's the meme, 45-55 in every matchup. Now, but the Titan deck, you do have a bit of kind of disruption, and your speed is a little bit faster than some of the other fair decks out there, so Titan may not be able to get their pieces online in time. However, they are still a pretty fast combo deck, so if you're thinking that you have the edge in this matchup, I think you may be mistaken. The Boros Energy deck overall, though, did have a pretty poor showing against the field. It was just not really where you wanted to be for this event specifically. 43.6% win rate overall. When you take the mirrors out, it's even lower at 42%. 52.6%. You lose a whole percentage point there. So despite being one of the more popular metagame choices, Boros Energy is not the Titan of the modern metagame that it used to be. It's actually an unfavorable matchup into the Titan deck. Now, one Ryan Nichols would have me saying that Tron is bad, but according to this head-to-head matchup matrix, Tron looked good. 51.9% win rate overall, 52.7% when you take the mirror matches out of it, and having a okay match spread against some of the top decks in the room, specifically Tameshi Belcher and the Boros Energy deck, is a pretty good place for Tron to be. Now, the one glaring weakness of Tron, however, seems to just be the absolute lack of anything it can do in the 13 Amulet Titan matchups that it played, where it has a dead 0% win rate. Same thing is kind of echoed against the Eldrazi ramp version. When people are starting to interact with your mana base, you start to struggle a little bit. In the Amulet Titan deck, you just really don't have any interaction for what they're doing. Even if you're playing something like Ugin, you can't get rid of their amulets. So Titan just kind of has your number there. So if you are a Tron enjoyer, you may rejoice in the fact that Titan's play patterns are a little bit difficult for people to just plug and play very quickly, even though there's a really detailed guide on it from Dom Harvey if you want to take a look at that. But the Eldrazi Tron deck seems to be in a pretty solid state overall, above 50% win rate against the field, and more than 50% win rate against a large majority of the other top decks you can expect to see in your modern metagame. Now, the Izzet Affinity list was something of a fan favorite this weekend, if not because Shuhei Nakamura was piloting a very interesting version using weapons manufacturing and some flashy plays on the board, but the Izzet Affinity list overall had a pretty decent win rate, as 50.6% overall, and slightly higher at 50.7% without the mirrors factored in, even though there weren't a ton of those. Just goes to show the deck was an above average pick for this event. Now, it did attack the top parts of the metagame fairly well, 60% win rate into the Esper Goryo's list, and a 56.7% win rate into Tameshi Belcher is pretty solid, while it was just slightly under 50% against Boros Energy, which we can kind of expect declining numbers in just because of the poor performance at this specific event. However, the Tron deck did kind of beat it up. 30.8% win rate is a very unfavorable matchup for Izzet Affinity, and although we only had 5 matches played head-to-head here against the Amulet Titan deck, it was in favor of the Titan side of things. So if these big mana decks in Tron and the Titan deck that is going to be putting big things or combo things out on the battlefield ahead of schedule are something that Affinity has trouble dealing with, you may want to go back and look at the package of artifacts that you can plug and play from the sideboard to see if there's anything to shore up the mana advantages that those decks create, so that you can play more on Affinity's access of attack and wind up overrunning them with Kappa Cannoneer and a bunch of small artifact robots because of it. All right, Izzet Blink, let's take a look at where things went a little wrong here. Now, I'm looking at your resume here, and even though your overall win rate was a little bit in the tank here, seeing 47.4%, and then not counting mirrors, 47.1%, so it dips a little bit there, you did have a little bit of a hard time against the Esper Goryos, the Boros Energy, and the Eldrazi Tron decks. Oh, and don't think I don't see that Eldrazi ramp blemish on the bottom there at a 0% win rate for that one, despite there only being 5 head-to-head matches. So it does kind of look like the Esper Blink deck struggled against half of the popular decks that were brought to the Pro Tour. It doesn't have the largest deck match sample size, however, but it does have a couple of good things to go. If you're expecting more Tameshi Belcher in the wake of this event because it won, even though it wasn't the best performing deck, 78.6% head-to-head win rate in 14 matches puts the Esper Blink solidly on the side of probably favorable matchup for that one. Likewise, it did have a slight advantage in the head-to-head against the Titan matchup, even though that one was only 7 matches played. So if you think people are going to gravitate towards deck that won the event or deck that had a high win rate at the event, Esper Blink looks to be something that you can try playing. If not, and you are still dedicated to the Blink package, maybe consider Matt Costa's Jeskai Blink list and see if that one can put up better head-to-head results in your testing against some of these problem decks like Goryo's, Energy, and Tron that the Esper version was having trouble with.
All right, let's take a look at where Titan was beating up on folks as that had the highest win rate of these top 10 presence decks at the event. And, well, I mean, the 100% win rate against Eldrazi Tron we've kind of addressed when we looked at that matchup. It also beat up on the Eldrazi Ramp deck, 100% win rate, although there's only 2 matches played there. So both Eldrazi decks, it was like Kozilek's Command or bust against what Titan was doing, hoping that it was a creature-based thing that Titan was doing and not like scape shift shenanigans. So Titan is definitely going to be a winner in that matchup there, as the decks both try to do something big, but they're not comboing and they're not flashy like Titan is. Now, Esper Goryo, surprisingly, the most played deck in the room, did have a slightly positive win rate into the Amulet Titan matchup. However, looking at these numbers here, you actually didn't play against Esper Goryos more than you played against some of the other decks, like Boros Energy or Tameshi Belcher. You played 3 less matches against Belcher than you did against Goryos, and Goryos had the most decks in the room. So Amulet Titan actually kind of got away with playing against the matchups it was better into versus playing against the less favorable matchup that was the most played deck at the Pro Tour by a little bit. So while you're looking at this top 10 presence list, yeah, Titan is pretty good against most of the decks in the room. You do have to see that there is a little bit of worry when it comes to Simic Neoform or Esper Bling, the Neoform deck potentially just being a little bit faster and a little bit bigger in its combo than what Titan is doing. But when you look at the field as a whole, Titan has a good matchup into the field in general. That normally because of the fact that Titan is a deck that you can practice with goldfishing very effectively. There are a lot of lines to identify when you are learning the deck. There's a very detailed guide out there that everybody always points to. I think this is like the 3rd or 4th time I've said it as well. So if you are wanting to do well in Modern, and you think that Titan is a great place to be because it's very high win rate against what you're seeing here in this video, you can practice on your own and get a lot of information that you can then transfer into practicing against other people quite easily. So Titan is a very good solo practice deck to get you like 70% of the way, and then you go to your LGS or go to your testing group, play games against other people to get the other 30% to really lock yourself down as a solid player, because it is a deck that will basically lose to you piloting it almost as much as it will lose to the opposing decks that may be hating on it. All right, so Simic Neoform is a deck that I don't have a ton of experience playing with or against. I know it as a combo deck. I've seen Canister do some silly things with it online, but when it comes to a paper Modern metagame against the other combo decks in the format, it was lacking a little bit. Specifically against the Esper Goryos deck, it did wind up being very poor head-to-head into the most played deck in the room. However, the other decks that it played the same amount of matches against, save for the mirror matchup surprisingly, it also struggled in 2 out of the 3 head-to-head matches there, only coming out even against the Boros Energy deck, which is in a point of struggle of the metagame in and of itself. However, if you are looking down the line a little bit more, you can see that Simic Neoform has even matchups against most of the other top 10 presence decks, and specifically, even though it was only 5 matches, an 80% win rate against the Amulet Titan list. So if you think people are going to be picking up Titan, or if people are going to be dropping Goryo specifically, Simic Neoform pilots may be able to come out to their LGS events and continue to grind Magic the Gathering online leagues and events there and still put up pretty decent results. However, if you are looking for a combo deck that does perform a little bit better against the field, may I suggest Amulet Titan? May I suggest Tameshi Belcher? May I look at Esper Goryos? There are still lists that can do something similar with stronger backup plans or less fragile plan A's that will do better against the field. So last time we checked in on Domain Zoo, it wasn't doing all that poorly. However, at the Pro Tour here, it was not the same force that it had been in previous Modern events. Now, it did wind up having the same win rate in both regular and non-mirror match head-to-heads here, 47.3%, but it's still a sub 50% win rate. And as you look at the top 10 decks that it played against, it doesn't really have favorable matchups against any of them. It has even matchups and a 57.1% win rate against Esper Goryos, which just goes to show that Domain Zoo is probably not in a good spot for the metagame right now. The metagame is very diverse. You can expect a lot of different variety of things to be that quote-unquote field of decks that you're playing against. However, if you're going to an LGS, the LGS may be a little bit more on the competitive side. Expect to play against one, if not more, of these top 10 decks every single round. So, or within the entire event. You go to like an F&M and it's 3 rounds, expect to see 3 of these. You may wind up getting somebody on their Modern Brew, which is that field of decks, but if you're packing Domain Zoo and you're going to an event and you're facing against one of these decks every single round, you're not going to be in the best position for yourself to walk away victorious. I would look at some of the energy lists or the blink list if you want to play something more to the board and you still want to be able to swing in with powerful creatures. Now, Domain Zoo could potentially see a resurgence if things like Consigned to Memory and Stubborn Denial can carry the list through against these combo decks, or if there's potential sideboard cards that with access to 5 colors, you can plug and play against what is more popular. However, if you are just trying to grind events, it may be time to put Zoo back on the shelf for just a little bit of time. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about the ramp package of Eldrazi deck, which is the one that is using Utopia Sprawl and being able to destroy your opponent's lands with green Eldrazi, as well as taking just full advantage of all of the different types of Eldrazi package things you can do. Now, this one actually was favorable against its brethren Eldrazi Tron deck. As it turns out, things like Worldbreaker and Myca Spawn were just really good at killing Tron lands, which the deck kind of needs to function. And your deck doesn't really, because you're playing basic lands that have Utopia Sprawl on them. Sure, if your basic land dies, that might be a little problematic, but a lot of these things kill non-basic lands, so you're usually pretty safe. Against the Esper Goryos list as well, you could just kind of delay them long enough in some of those matches to be slightly favorable against that deck, as opposed to just being a dead even 50-50, and some of the more fair decks like the Boros Energy and Domain Zoo matches were a little more even or slightly even favored in your way, even though there is a very small single-digit sample size here at this event. Now, the couple of decks you do have to watch out for are going to be Tameshi Belcher. Deck is combo-y, deck is too fast, you can't interact with it the same way you can with other decks. Izzet Affinity, deck is not combo-y, deck is fast, deck go wide, deck play lots of things, and even if you kill their one land, well, all of their artifacts basically tap for mana, so not the most favorable for you. And Amulet Titan. It's Amulet Titan. You're not going to be able to do a whole lot against it. The Eldrazi Tron deck couldn't even do a lot against the Amulet Titan deck. So Eldrazi Ramp enjoyers, you may want to shift back and forth between Tron and Ramp if you have the cards available to you, just depending on the flavor of the month. However, if you are just dedicated to practicing your Eldrazi Ramp shell, if you see a lot of Goryos, a lot more Tron, and a lot more of the fair decks like Blink and Energy, continue playing Eldrazi Ramp to your heart's desire. You'll probably be fine.
There are lots of modern spells getting sung all across the Pro Tour floor in Atlanta. Which ones were your favorite? Were there any decks that made waves at the Pro Tour that you were happy to take a spin on or take a look at those deck lists? Or is there something that you've been cooking up that did not make an appearance in the hands of the pros? Are there some Spider-Man cards that you've been cooking with? Or do you think that what they had at the Pro Tour was pretty much everything that was viable? Let me know in the comments down below what you're playing or what you are hip to in Modern. And while you're down there, give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the event recaps that I do, such as this one. Now, if you are so inclined to, of course, you can also look at that join button down below or on my channel's homepage to become one of my members. Now, members, in exchange for monetary support of this and every single video on my channel, get member benefits such as early access to all of my content, both written and video form, as well as Discord access so we can talk about slinging spells. You can show me some deck lists. I could give you some ideas on it. You just have a direct line to me when I'm usually supposed to be doing normal work. You can click that join button down below or on the main page of my channel to show your devotion. And as always, it would behoove you as well as me if you could just tap that subscribe button, because for free it lets you stay up to date on all sorts of deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general Magic the Gathering content that I'm putting together. See you at the next event recap.